Hello, dreamers, and welcome to the 323rd episode of Killafornia Dreaming. I want to thank you all so much for being here with me. It is 2026, so Happy New Year, everybody, and we are headed back to California for today's case. There is a slightly eclectic cast of characters in this story. I first saw this case earlier last year on Dateline, but it is a case that took many years to work its way through the court system for various reasons, and would end up being one of the longest and most complicated and expensive cases in California history. And I really had to listen to this story 2 or 3 times to make sure that I didn't miss any of the shenanigans, and actually Dateline did miss a few of them. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Pay close attention because blink and you'll miss one of the many cons that seem to be going on all over the place in this story from start to finish. So let's get into today's case. This is the tale of the double cross. What happened to Cliff Lambert? This is a story where I had to work at reminding myself that there are some things that you just really can't make up. And, those are the stories that I do like to try and find for the show. And this is really one like it came out of some sort of wild movie plot. Recently, well, I think it was in December, I rewatched the Hulu series There's Something About Pam with Renee Zellweger as Pam Hupp, right? And I was like, I need another wild story kind of like that to talk about. And sure enough, I just watched an episode of Dateline sometime like late last year, and it covered the story that we're talking about today. And I'm seeing that our favorite TV shows like Dateline and 48 Hours and 2020, they're kind of reaching back and telling the cases that have happened, several years ago, older cases. I feel like last year and the last couple of years, especially during the COVID years, we had a lot of new cases, breaking cases, and now we're really reaching back to find some stories that kind of got overlooked at the time for one reason or another. And this case is one of them. It starts back really in the 1960s, and we kind of go through the fun times that the various characters that we're going to meet had together throughout the decades. It has a lot to do with old money and that era of Hollywood celebrities and the partying that they used to do in the nearby Southern California resort town of Palm Springs. During the 1950s and 1960s, Palm Springs became a very popular vacation destination, so much so that Palm Springs actually has its own Walk of Fame called the Palm Springs Walk of Stars. And Palm Springs ultimately became the place a gentleman named Cliff Lambert ended up after spending half of the 1960s selling lithographs of famous works of art through a mail order type of business. And it was quite successful and lucrative and made Cliff somewhat wealthy, or at least he had the appearance of wealth and to be a man of means. Nothing about Cliff Lambert was understated, and he very much fell in line with that golden era of Hollywood celebrity and partying. But Cliff ended up leaving New York in the mid-1960s and headed for all of the fun located on the opposite coast. He took his art dealing business to Los Angeles, where he again earned himself the distinguished reputation of being an art dealer to the stars. Cliff, of course, lived up to his reputation and partied to his heart's content throughout the 1970s. Now, Cliff wasn't ever a household name or anything like that, but that didn't seem to much matter to Cliff. He was able to keep up with the richest and the most famous of them, and like I mentioned, I did first hear about this story on Dateline, and one of the main people that was interviewed for their episode was a gentleman by the name of Eddie Mullican. Eddie met Cliff in 2006, so this will be well into Cliff's retirement, but he was still out there socializing and dating. While most of the people in the story are gay men, including Cliff and Eddie, the two of them were always just friends and didn't come into Cliff's life until he was in his early 70s. But they were really just fast friends. Cliff Lambert loved nice things and he had nice things. He purchased a beautiful 5,000 square foot home amongst the Palm Springs celebrities and socialites, and he fit right in with the best of them. He drove around town in a Rolls-Royce Corniche. He wore only the highest end Italian designer clothing. Everything had to be the best. And he kind of reminds me of my ex-mother-in-law, because she looked like she had money, but she really didn't have money. It was her family that had money. And while Cliff, he made his own money, he kind of had this air about him that gave off the impression that he actually had more than he really had, but it didn't really matter. It was what he wanted people to think of him. It was the perception he wanted people to have. But when it comes to my ex-mother-in-law, one time I remember wondering why she was so outrageously willing to just blow all of her money really fast, because she lived on a trust fund. She got a lump sum of money at the beginning of the month. And what she would do is just go and blow all of that money in 1 week. It was like a few $1,000s each month that she was given as an allowance. And I questioned him. I was like, why does your mom do that? Why doesn't she feel comfortable having money in the bank or in her pocket? And my ex-husband told me, quote, "My mom always feels like if something isn't expensive, then it's not worth it." And that was her state of mind. But when you're a trust fund baby and you don't know the value of a dollar, you might say something stupid like that to yourself. I wouldn't go so far to say that Cliff had that kind of money and that he was that frivolous with it, but he could legitimately walk around and have that type of attitude because he was able to pull it off. His wealth didn't go that deep, but it didn't matter to him. It's what he wanted people to think of him. And he was able to keep that image up very well. Cliff Lambert loved the attention, and sometimes you garner more attention than you intend to attract. And he was attracting attention from people who were very dialed in on what Cliff Lambert had, or at least what he bragged about having. And there are people that want the same things and who are willing to take it if they think they found an easy target. And in 2008, that is exactly the type of attention that Cliff Lambert was attracting. So Eddie Mullican, being such good friends with Cliff, would be one of the first in his life to notice that something was amiss. Eddie described Cliff as a person with a huge presence, a huge personality, and he was not one to be held back or held down from doing whatever he wanted to do whenever he wanted to do it. Cliff had an exuberant personality and was well liked everywhere he set down roots. I mentioned first he landed in New York City. He had come from a small Midwestern town in Missouri, and he really could not get out of there fast enough. He started with New York, and then he made his way to Los Angeles, and finally he settled in Palm Springs. The thing that kind of put a damper on everything in the 1980s with the gay community was the AIDS epidemic. And I was pretty young at the time when the first cases of AIDS were diagnosed in the United States. But I do remember the impact the disease had on the country and the attitude towards it all, and how much fear there was in terms of how contagious this disease was. I don't even know if I understood at the time the impact that AIDS was having on the gay community, but it was devastating. There was so much paranoia and misinformation out there, but the fact was the virus did have a tremendous effect, and it was ultimately what prompted Cliff to decide that it was time for a change of pace and a change of lifestyle from living there in Los Angeles. So he picked up and moved to the vacation mecca to the stars, Palm Springs. Cliff had lost most of his friends at that time to the AIDS virus, so there just wasn't much left in Los Angeles for him, but lingering grief as friend after friend after friend succumbed to the devastating disease. Eddie Mullican did not meet Cliff until well into the 2000s, But despite that, he still described Cliff as a best friend with a huge personality that could not be reined in. But Eddie himself was quite the character with an equally interesting backstory of his own. The Dateline episode on this case described Eddie as the blonde boy of the moment in the adult entertainment industry during most of the 1990s. He was a model for gay magazines and publications and filmed dozens of adult movies. He had a different stage name that he went by, but it looks like the guy used what he had while he could and managed to come out the other end of it with a comfortable life for himself. It doesn't seem like Eddie was overtaken by the seedier side of this lifestyle. Like, he didn't get too caught up into the drugs. The adult entertainment industry didn't really take as much of a toll on Eddie as it may have on other adult entertainers in the 80s and 90s, if you know what I mean. It's like, okay, here's a guy who made it and didn't necessarily fall victim to the pitfalls of the adult entertainment industry and what it's known for. And one night, Cliff walked into a club that Eddie was dancing in for tips, and just like that, they became friends. And it was kind of a weird way that Cliff approached Eddie to begin with at their first meeting. He wasn't really looking at Eddie, but he was giving him dollar bills, and he told Eddie that he would pay him well if he would accompany him to Argentina. And while that extravagant vacation never really came to fruition, the friendship did. And the two men ended up taking other vacations together to New York and to Hawaii. And all the while, Eddie insisted that their relationship was never romantic. At the time that they met, they had both been through a really rough breakup, so they found that common ground to start from, and they ended up helping each other through the worst of it. And I mentioned that Eddie came into Cliff's life when he was already over the age of 70. And unfortunately, Eddie came into Cliff's life just a couple of years before his life would come to an abrupt and mysterious end. And just like most cities, the resort city of Palm Springs, every December, as many communities do, they have some sort of holiday celebration or parade in the evening at the beginning of the month, right? You know what I'm talking about. I don't mean like the Tournament of Roses or the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade or anything like that. I mean more of like the local Christmas parade. When I lived in Long Beach, there was one every year, I think the first weekend of December. And Palm Springs had theirs as well. It was called the Annual Festival of Lights. Well, Eddie and Cliff had plans to go to the festival together that evening of December 5th. They were going to meet there. Oh yeah, this is 2008, by the way. December 5th, 2008. They were going to meet there and watch the parade together, but Cliff failed to show up, which was very out of character for him. And Eddie, he's that friend that has the key to your house in case of an emergency, right? Everyone has that trusted friend, and Eddie was that guy for Cliff. I don't exactly know when Eddie went to go check on Cliff, if it was the night of the Festival of Lights, that was the 5th of December, or if he went the next day. But Eddie didn't allow that much time to elapse before he went looking to see if everything was okay with his friend. So Eddie went over there to Cliff's house and let himself in. He took a look around and really didn't see anything unusual or out of place. It did look as if Cliff had had some company. There were some cocktails that had been had. There was like watered down drinks and glasses where ice had melted. There were some cigarette butts in the ashtray on the table, and Eddie, luckily, made note of the brand of cigarettes that they were. They were Benson and Hedges. Cliff did not smoke at all, so there had been somebody else over that had smoked that brand of cigarettes, and that's going to become an important detail way down the line at the end of the story. There were 2 glasses, and they appeared to have been, like I said, watered down with liquor in them. So Eddie figured that Cliff had some company, maybe a date, and that there's a perfectly plausible reason why he didn't show up for the Festival of Lights. It wasn't like Cliff to blow off his friends, but who knows? After you get a couple of drinks in him and everything's out the window, right? Eddie decided that he should just go ahead and go home and try to reconnect with Cliff the following day. He'll just give him a call or whatever, and he let himself out and locked the door behind him. Eddie, when he went to Cliff's house, didn't go much further past the foyer and the entrance hallway. He didn't look anywhere else around the house. Once he put it together that Cliff seemed to have had other plans he attended to instead, he figured that Cliff would just call him and fill him in. But the thing is that call never came. And this continued to bother Eddie because it just wasn't like Cliff to ghost people like this. He was very easy to get a hold of and was always in touch, always in communication. So Eddie mulled over what to do next. He confided in a couple of friends, and eventually he decided to report Cliff missing. He just felt like it needed to be known in some official capacity that Cliff Lambert was missing and that this was very out of character for him. And I can just imagine Eddie sitting around trying to figure out what to do next, like someone you care about who is supposed to be where they're supposed to be, but is nowhere to be found, and they don't necessarily have any place where they have to be. It just kind of gets confusing and you don't know what to do. It's not like Cliff had anybody to answer to. He had no family nearby that he needed to attend to. He didn't have a job. He didn't have any obligations. So, how do you look for somebody who really doesn't have to be anywhere? It didn't seem like any of these guys had very close connections with family that were nearby who could account for their whereabouts. And so Eddie just decided to make that missing persons report himself. And then what? Well, everything was just quiet, and it stayed quiet. Nothing happened, and Eddie was just kind of sitting around waiting to hear something, anything, but there was just nothing. I can imagine feeling restless and helpless because it's like, what are you supposed to do? Even if you don't know that there's not really anything wrong, or maybe there is something catastrophically wrong, you just don't know. It's kind of confusing. Like, Cliff is supposed to be here and he's just not, and it's just not feeling right. So a few days after reporting Cliff missing, Eddie decided to go back to Cliff's house to see if anything had changed or if Cliff had come back or whatever he could find. And when he got there, he found that the door had been left open, unlocked. The glasses that he had seen with the watered down liquor in them were gone. And the cigarette butts that were left behind had been cleaned up too. So Eddie took this as kind of a relief. But at the same time, he still didn't understand why Cliff had gone silent on him. Eddie just sort of pep talked himself into believing that everything was okay. Cliff was around somewhere. They're just not around his house at the same time. They just keep missing each other. Everything's fine. He's fine. He cleaned up his house. The mess is gone. He's doing the normal things that he does and probably just wants some time to himself or whatever company it is that he's keeping. But more and more days continued to pass, and Eddie continued to try to convince himself that everything was okay, but it was getting to the point where Eddie couldn't even be convinced to keep lying to himself anymore either. But he did for as long as he could. He wanted to hope that Cliff was okay. And just one day he was going to pop up with whatever better be some good explanation of where he's been as far as Eddie was concerned. In the Dateline episode, the prosecutor on the case, her name is Lisa DeMaria, she very astutely described this as a case of like Alice in Wonderland falling into a massive rabbit hole. And by the end of the story, you're going to see why. But Eddie continued to hang on to hope. Palm Springs was a very lively, busy town, and it was not unusual for people to drop off the radar for a short period of time. It didn't mean that there was anything wrong. I hear about the same thing happening in Vegas. People come to Vegas, they lose touch with their friends, they lose their phones, they drink, they fall asleep somewhere. People get lost on Friday and then they show back up on Sunday morning. While there wasn't much more Eddie could do but wait, there was still kind of the same thing that the detective who was assigned to the case had to do. Kind of just wait also. There really wasn't anything to indicate a crime had even happened. That detective given Cliff's case, his name was Detective Frank Browning. He sort of had the same idea that Eddie had. Just give it a few days and Cliff will resurface and everyone will feel stupid for overreacting. People show up for the holidays, things go a little awry, people end up not coming home the next day and they get reported missing, and when it was just a matter of them waking up or finding their phones eventually and then getting back in touch with the people who were worried about them. Well, this was 2008, so the technology wasn't quite as advanced as it is now when you're trying to track someone down, but at the time, the world was on the cusp of where we're at now, leaving digital breadcrumbs everywhere we go. In fact, you're going to come to find that there's going to be a couple of firsts that happen in this case, and one of them being the use of an iPhone and trying to unlock that technology. This was going to be a case where the detectives had never seen an iPhone before. It wasn't going to be all that useful in finding Cliff because Cliff still had a flip phone at the time. But investigators on this case were going to have some really fast courses on smartphones. And when it comes to trying to untangle the truth of this entire story, they were going to have to employ the services of a hacker. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. But anyway, Detective Browning got onto the case. He also let it just kind of sit and cook for a few days as well, just to see if Cliff would eventually turn up. However, when all remained quiet and Cliff remained missing, that's when the detective decided to start doing a little looking around for himself. Detective Browning drove over to Cliff's house, and one of the first things he noticed was that the mailbox was stuffed full of mail, which is an indication that nobody had really been home, possibly, but I mean, that all depends on where the mailbox is located. If the mailbox slot was next to the front door, then yeah, maybe if he could look in there and see that there was a whole bunch of mail piled up. But if your mailbox is out by the curb and the delivery person just kind of drives by and puts the day's mail in there, you might not necessarily walk out to the mailbox every single day to check it. And I certainly don't do that here where I have to walk over to the mailbox to get it either. I wait like a week or two to check the mail, at least these days. But then again, these guys are old school. My dad checked the mail every single day that it was delivered. It was sort of a part of his daily routine. And now that I mention it, one of the last things my dad did in the moments right before he passed away was reading his mail. He had been out in the garage fixing one of my mom's brooms or something. Her broom handle had cracked, and it was June, and it was getting really hot in the garage. So he went inside and he sat at the counter to look at his mail, and he was opening letters and whatnot. And suddenly he had a massive heart attack, fell over and died. And another life lesson that I had from my dad, whenever you go on vacation, suspend your mail and newspaper deliveries so that it doesn't appear that there's nobody there. I recently told my daughter that too because she was letting like the little weekly advertisement newspapers that gets tossed onto your driveway to pile up. There were like 3 or 4 papers on the driveway, and I told her that it would probably be a good idea if she picked them up and at least threw them into the recycling bin so that it doesn't look like the house is abandoned, because it really does kind of look like that at this point. She's the only one living there and the car is in the garage, so it just kind of looks like nobody's there all the time. But anyway, the detective was in the house about a week after Eddie reported Cliff missing. Other than the mailbox being full, it didn't look like there was much else going on or all that much out of the ordinary. The place didn't look like it had been burglarized. There was no ransacking, no furniture was turned over. Nothing seemed weird. And for the most part, most of Cliff's friends weren't really all that concerned about him having gone missing for a few days. It wasn't unusual for these guys who really have no obligation to anything to just up and take off here or there. And it just so happened that a few days after not hearing from Cliff at all, his friends did start getting emails purportedly from him. He said something about having a really difficult recovery from some oral surgery and that he was going to rehab in Maui for a few weeks and that he really didn't want to be alone in that house there in Palm Springs. Eddie did point out that it wasn't like Cliff to communicate with him by way of email, but he just kind of rationalized the whole thing in his own mind. maybe Cliff was going through something and this is just the way that he wanted things to be for the time being. He wants to disconnect. He has every right to do so, in fact. After all, that is the exact reason why Cliff ended up in Palm Springs to begin with. He needed a change of pace after so many of his friends were lost to the AIDS epidemic. He came to Palm Springs because he wanted to rub elbows with the likes of Zsa Zsa Gabor and Lucille Ball, and that's exactly what he was there to be doing. Now, everybody in life has that one relationship, right? The one that was the love of your life. Maybe some of us have two. I don't know. We convince ourselves that the one we're with is the one, and then ends up in divorce and a breakup. And all of a sudden, you open yourself up to meeting the next great love of your life. Well, there's always that one that didn't work out and the one that got away, and, that once in a lifetime chance that you were with somebody and for whatever reason, you just couldn't be together. Cliff had at least one long-term relationship, but there was a 40-year age difference between the two. Cliff was pushing 60 when he started dating a 19-year-old named Travis Hobbs. Travis was a young man who longed for that good life, that life of wealth and excess, the kind of life that Cliff himself had lived for so many years. Travis wanted that. And yeah, while it did seem as if this was a sugar daddy type of relationship, one that was mutually beneficial in their own ways, after a while, their circle of friends and family did eventually come around and accept the fact that the two really did share a genuine love and bond with one another. And it wasn't that out of the ordinary for older men to be in relationships with much younger men. Eddie called them the gays and the grays that they love. Well, their relationship ended after about 15 years. And the way that Dateline worded it and how it happened kind of sounded awkward to me. They sort of glossed over the whole thing. But what the host of the show said about the end of Cliff and Travis's relationship was this, quote, "Cliff and Travis were together for 15 years before the split up. Travis moved out on Cliff and in with a friend. That ended in August of 2007. Somebody went outside and saw Travis at the bottom of the pool and he had drowned. And Cliff went into a whirlpool of depression," unquote. So I don't know all the details beyond the blurb that Dateline said about it. I looked around and there wasn't very much information about the drowning, unfortunately, but that marked yet another event that caused a cosmic shift in Cliff's life. Cliff turned to drinking in order to deal with the pain of the loss of his longtime partner. The normally outgoing, friendly, social Cliff Lambert was isolating, lonely, and drinking to the bottom of every bottle. But after a few months and into the early part of 2008, Cliff began to come out of his grief and sadness and decided that maybe it was time perhaps to start dating once again. And so Cliff looked to Eddie for some advice on the best ways to get himself out there, to dip his toe into the dating pool once again. But Eddie had some news for Cliff. The days of going to bars and meeting random people like that on the street is still a thing, but there was a new way of dating that was overtaking tradition. And, it's the place where a lot of us meet the next best thing to come into our lives, right? Online. Well, personal ads have been a thing for quite some time. And I remember seeing those ads in the classifieds and thinking that it was kind of a weird way to try to meet people. There were those mail order bride type things. And it dates back centuries actually. And just out of curiosity, I looked for a brief history of the personal ad or the Lonely Hearts columns. And yeah, the first known personal ad that was printed dates back to 1695 apparently. And then in the early 1700s, and I want to say 1722 to be exact, at the time, Benjamin Franklin, the guy with the kite and the key and the bifocals, he apparently wrote for a publication that belonged to his brother called the New England Current. And I thought this was kind of an interesting historical little tidbit here. The article isn't that long, so I think I'll just read it and link it in the show notes for you. It was written May 27th, 2005 by Michael Nordine for historyfacts.com. The article said, among all the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin had the most interesting extracurricular activities. Before he studied electricity or invented bifocals, America's first postmaster general had a habit of writing essays for his brother's Boston newspaper under the pseudonym Silence Dogood. The then 16-year-old posed as a widow because the writing he submitted under his own name was rejected by the New England Courant, which his older brother James published. Silence had so much to say about a variety of subjects, with her commentary touching on such subjects as religion and politics, and she was an instant hit with the weekly paper's readers. She even received marriage proposals. 14 of those essays were published beginning in 1722, but all good things must come to an end. After slipping Silence's correspondence under the Courant's door for several months, Franklin eventually revealed his true identity. His brother was none too pleased with this deception, having warned the younger Franklin against growing too vain in the wake of the essay's warm reception, and the fallout played a part in Franklin's departure for Philadelphia, the city where he would live for the rest of his life. In an article on allocation.com, it said that personal ads first appeared more than 300 years ago, and the first personal ad thought to have ever been published was in 1695, so some 27 or so years prior to Benjamin Franklin writing those satirical essays for the New England Courant. And it was said to have been published as a matrimonial ad that was printed in a British publication on July 19, 1695. At the time, most ads were placed by 20-something men who were interested in younger women who come from or have money. But this article also quoted one of Benjamin Franklin's personal ads. It said that on April 23, 1722, the New England Courant in Boston carried this ad, quote, "Any young gentlewoman that is minded to dispose of herself in marriage to a well-accomplished young widower and has 500 or 600 pounds to secure him by deed or gift, she may go to the sign of the gas lanthorn," that's a British term for lantern, "in Steeple Square, to find all the encouragement she can reasonably desire." It did point out that the author of that was Benjamin Franklin, and it was meant to be a joke, so they were common enough at the time for people to sort of make fun of the whole idea of personal ads. The article went on to say, quote, "In 1727, lonely English spinster Helen Morrison became the first woman to place an ad in a Lonely Hearts column. She was desperate enough that she talked the editor of the Manchester Weekly Journal into placing a small ad stating that she was seeking someone nice to spend her life with. She immediately received a response. The mayor had her committed to an insane asylum for 4 weeks as a result. And personal ads just kind of evolved from there and continued to grow in popularity through the 1800s. And then when the 1900s rolled around, the personal ads were found more in magazines and not so much in the mainstream newspapers, as the ads were also spawning scams and the big newspapers didn't want to be a part of that. They wanted to report on the scams, but they didn't want to help perpetrate them by running those personal ads anymore. As the late 1900s wore on, getting past mid-century, the personal ads became more popular than ever with the free-loving hippie crowd, as well as the gay community, as people were becoming more open and free with their sexuality. And by the 1980s, getting married wasn't the priority for people placing ads as it was for people looking for casual dating type situations. When we get into the 1990s, Match.com was launched. That happened in 1995. And by the late 90s, websites like Craigslist were listing personal ads as well, but they took that section down in 2018 after Congress passed a sweeping bill on trafficking, and they really wasted no time Craigslist, that is, wasted no time in pulling down their section on seeking romantic connections the day that bill passed. It was called the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. While there was some pushback from free speech and sex worker advocacy groups, the bill passed overwhelmingly, as what the bill did was pretty much make sure that Craigslist would be held liable, or Craigslist or any publication would be held liable both criminally and civilly if users misuse the online personal ads to commit crimes. I actually didn't realize until I researched the timeline of personal ads that Craigslist had kept their personal section up 9 years after the Craigslist killer, Philip Markoff, had committed those crimes by using sex workers that he found on Craigslist. At the time, the personal sections was called erotic services, and then after Philip Markoff committed those 3 robberies and 1 murder under the guise of calling these women up for their services, Craigslist renamed the section adult services, but then ended up pulling it down altogether once that trafficking bill passed, but it was still up for another 9 years even after the Craigslist killer had happened. Well, anyway, that was a side story that took us off track for a minute. Sorry about that, but I thought it was kind of interesting. However, anyways, by 2008, people were definitely going online more and more and meeting people that way. And it was Cliff's friend Eddie who kind of showed the then 73, 74-year-old how to navigate his way through online dating. That would have happened in April of 2008 when Eddie introduced Cliff to online dating and helped him set up his profiles. Only 8 months prior to that December 5th evening when Cliff Lambert failed to show up to meet his friends for the annual Festival of Lights parade there in Palm Springs. And Cliff very quickly found himself a match that he was interested in. A very, very much younger man, a guy from San Francisco, California, so not exactly right around the corner from Palm Springs, but still quite a distance. There aren't too many states where you can be 800 miles away from someone and still be in the same state. I mean, 800 miles as the crow flies. From north to south, California is a little over 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers. But when you have money, like it seemed like Cliff had, it doesn't matter. And in short order, he connected with this guy, purchased him a plane ticket, and wanted him to come visit him in Palm Springs. At some point, Cliff reached out to Eddie wanting to introduce him to this new friend that he met from San Francisco. And Eddie was like, yeah, for sure. And he came over, and that is when Eddie, for the first time, met the new guy that Cliff was seeing, a then 25-year-old named Danny Garcia. And the guy seemed really, really nice. He was good looking, very smart. He's the one that the Dateline episode labeled as the whiz kid. At least, this is what Eddie's initial vibe on this guy was. And it seemed as excited as Cliff was getting to know Danny, Danny was equally as excited, wanting to share the news with his friends back home in San Francisco about this new older man that he just met. And it seemed like things were going along well. That is, until Cliff Lambert turned up missing. He was nowhere to be found that early December day that he suddenly vanished. And the whole entire thing not only confused Cliff's friends, especially his best friend Eddie, but it was also very perplexing to Detective Browning as well as time passed. There was really no hint, idea, or clue as to what in the world became of Cliff Lambert. December flew by without so much as a word from anyone about anything having to do with Cliff, except for those emails. There was just literally nothing. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. They didn't even know if a crime had taken place. They had no idea what they were looking at. But it was right after Christmas of 2008 and just before the new year that Detective Browning received a phone call from a real estate agent from the San Francisco area with some interesting information. Apparently, that real estate agent had been approached about wanting to sell a house in Palm Springs. The thing was, this person, this potential client, wanted to do what he termed a fire sale. In the real estate business, a fire sale happens when a property owner is anxious to sell their home quickly, usually at a price that is well below the home's actual market value for reasons related to financial issues or other circumstances where the owner needed to get rid of the property very quickly. It's not something that is beneficial for the seller, except for the fact that they'll be able to liquidate assets very quickly for whatever pressing matter is at hand. But for a buyer, it can be very, very beneficial getting a house at a bargain basement price, right? And this is where we're going to be introduced to yet another player in this game. The gentleman who was interested in selling Cliff's house. His name was Kashul Nirula. And he did come with the mother of all backstories. He told the realtor that he was an exiled prince from Nepal, and that he had recently been given the home owned by Cliff Lambert in a settlement that he recently reached in some legal wranglings. Now, this real estate agent was a little suspect from the start. You don't get foreign royalty coming around your real estate office looking to quickly sell a home that often. And let's not forget, to put this all into perspective, this was December of 2008 going into January of 2009, and the world was in a great recession at the time. The housing market had crashed, so people everywhere were struggling to get out from under mortgages that they could no longer afford. So this exiled prince calling in between Christmas and New Year's of 2008 was a little bit of a red flag anyway. However, what he was wanting to do wasn't typical either, so that real estate agent ended up Googling Cliff Lambert's name, and that's when he discovered that there was a missing persons alert that came up in several search results, that this guy was missing from the Palm Springs area just about 3 weeks earlier, and now someone was trying to sell his home. So that is when this real estate agent looked up Palm Springs police and tracked down the detective working on the case, Detective Browning. And he turned that information over to a colleague who worked with fraud cases to take a look into the potential real estate transaction to see if this was actually something legitimate or if they had another potential crime on their hands relating to this open and active missing persons case. Did Cliff Lambert give the go-ahead for this sale, or was something untoward happening here? And this was just about when we're going to meet yet another player in this convoluted story. Before Detective Browning was able to get a hold of this Prince Kashul Nirulo, I can't even say his name, I'm so sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I think I'm talking too fast because this is a long episode. So what I think I might do is go ahead and split it into 2 parts. But anyway, I want these episodes to be at least an hour long, and we're quickly approaching that as we go along here. So anyway, before the detective was able to get a hold of this Prince Kashul Nirola, how do I say his name? It's so, I say it differently every single time, and I don't mean to. We'll just call him Kashul. How about that? I got his first name down. Before he got a hold of him, his office phone rang yet again with another thing going on with Cliff Lambert. For a guy who's missing, this detective certainly was hearing about a lot of activity happening on the periphery of Cliff's life. The phone call was a tip that someone had spotted a U-Haul truck parked in front of Cliff's house. And by no means should there be any kind of vehicles coming or going from Cliff's house at that point unless it's for official police business. But it doesn't even seem like they even really took that close of a look inside of Cliff's house to begin with. I, up to this point, haven't even heard it mentioned that anyone ever got a warrant so they can go and look around and see for themselves if there was anything that could indicate what had happened to Cliff. Well, either way, there should not have been a U-Haul doing anything at Cliff's house. So Detective Browning and the fraud investigator he turned to for help, it was a gentleman by the name of Detective Min. He was helping to look into the real estate transaction that Prince Kashul was interested in. The two of them together went over to Cliff's house, and sure enough, there was a guy out there with a U-Haul, and that guy was the character that gets introduced at this point in the story. His name was Miguel Bustamante. At the time, he was also 25 years old, and he worked as a bartender in San Francisco. He hadn't done anything just yet, but he was definitely getting ready to pack up, I guess, as much of whatever he could from Cliff's house or whatever he was told to get. When he was questioned by the detectives, he had a story that he had been paid to come down to Palm Springs to clear the house out of some artwork, that it was being sold. And there was nothing really alarming about Miguel Bustamante. He was pleasant, helpful, cooperative, even though what he was doing there was highly suspicious and probably very, very criminal. He wasn't combative, he answered questions. He even took the detectives over to the motel room that he was staying in and voluntarily allowed them to search it. And they did actually find some pretty incriminating stuff inside that motel room, stuff that very much belonged to one missing Cliff Lambert. Miguel Bustamante had all sorts of stuff in his motel that belonged to Cliff. Designer luggage, Cliff's wallet, his ID cards, his driver's license, his credit cards, his checkbook, just a plethora of things that belonged to a missing person that this other person really needs to have a good explanation as to why he's now in possession of these things. Now, come to find that the detective did do a cursory walkthrough at Cliff's house at the onset of the investigation into his disappearance, and he did remember seeing that same Louis Vuitton luggage in Cliff's house that was now sitting in Miguel's motel. But once they saw all of Cliff's important things like ID cards, credit cards, checkbooks, and the like, it became obvious to the detectives that there was definitely something wrong and that Cliff hadn't just gone off the grid for a while. He wouldn't have gone off the grid without means of getting off the grid, and this was turning out to be much more than a guy who needed to just get away for a few weeks. So Miguel Bustamante was arrested and charged with residential burglary. After being questioned further down at the station, investigators learned that the person who allegedly hired Miguel to clear out Cliff's house was none other than the Prince of Nepal himself, Kashul Nirula. Miguel claimed that they met while he was bartending one evening and they became friends or whatever, and ultimately he hired him to do this job for him, supposedly telling him the same story, that he acquired Cliff's home in a legal settlement and was interested in selling it but first needed it cleared out. But it didn't matter. Miguel was going to be charged either way. Now, during the questioning of Miguel Bustamante, Detective Browning did ask him what all he was supposed to take with him, and Miguel said mainly the artwork that Cliff had in his home. And for his trouble, according to Miguel, he was going to be paid by way of Cliff's Rolls-Royce Corniche. He was to be given the title of the vehicle for his troubles. Now, this is when investigators really started calling BS on Miguel Bustamante's story. I tried to look up the model year of Cliff's Rolls-Royce, but I was unable to find it, so I have no idea how much this particular vehicle was worth at the time. But to be paid by way of someone else's car, to do one day's worth of working, and to only be having to pick up artwork, to be given the equivalent of probably several $100,000s, depending on what year and how good of condition the Rolls-Royce was in, it wasn't difficult for these detectives to be calling him out on the ridiculousness of the story. And they tell him, you know what? You're in possession of all these things that belong to a guy that's been missing for 3 weeks. And it's like, you're it, dude. You're the one guy that we've got right now, and you're holding the bag. And while Miguel did try to appease the detectives, insisting that he was trying to be honest, but they're just kind of like done sitting there listening to this guy tell them stories like they're stupid, it's insulting, and they let Miguel know, like, dude, you're really in a messed up way right now. But Miguel kept trying to put everything off on Kashul. However, the investigators weren't having it, and they told him that he really needed to sit in that jail cell and think about himself and stop concerning himself with trying to get Kashul in trouble. Miguel was the one that they had in custody. He has the belongings of a missing man. So yeah, he's got some problems on his hands. Well, Miguel answered a few more questions that day and was eventually brought back to his cell for the night. After having some time to think about his story a little bit more, Miguel decided to try and sell a different fairy tale to the investigators. I don't know how long it was before Miguel asked to speak to Detective Browning again, But, these things usually happen pretty fast, and we've seen these people try to sell a story to the police with the hopes of being able to go home and not get arrested. And just about most of the time, they end up in a cell for the night, and the next morning, they ask to start talking to the detectives again. And usually they come back to hear what they have to say after having slept on it for the night. And this is a story that Miguel came up with for them after having an evening to think about it by himself in a jail cell. Cliff had been tricked into going to Mexico in order to purchase some expensive paintings, some Pablo Picassos even, at a discounted price. But when they got to Mexico, Cliff was kidnapped. And it was during the telling of this Picassos in Mexico story that yet another name gets dropped into this story. And it's a name that we've already heard, Danny Garcia. Danny Garcia, of course, was the 25-year-old from San Francisco that Cliff met while online dating. He flew him to Palm Springs and struck up a relationship. As far as I could see, I don't know all the details regarding their relationship and what all transpired between them the time that they met in April of 2008 to the time that Cliff went missing 8 months later. There's going to be some more to that story, which we'll go through as we get to the timeline. We do know that Danny did end up pretty much living with Cliff in Palm Springs at his home. And all the while, this plot, this scheme, this plan was forming in the background. This plan that involved the bartender, Miguel, the Prince of Nepal, Kashul, and there will be even more people involved before the story finally comes to its conclusion. And according to this bartender, Miguel Bustamante, the plot was born the moment Cliff Lambert and Danny Garcia went out on their first date. Miguel's story was that it was Danny Garcia's plan from the jump to send Cliff to Mexico for an art deal. Where in Mexico is anybody's guess, but I'll give you a hint. It was nowhere in Mexico. This never happened. But Miguel was sticking to that story. He stayed as vague as he possibly could with this new story, so he didn't really have a specific location in Mexico. He didn't have any idea where anyone could be. He didn't know anybody else who might be able to provide information regarding Cliff's whereabouts. It was really a whole lot of nothing. The only person who apparently knew where Cliff might be would be Danny Garcia, according to Bustamante. And with that, Cliff's good friend, Eddie Mullican, was now going to have to come to terms with the fact that something dreadful had likely happened to his friend. For the entire month of December, Eddie held on to a slim hope that Cliff was just off doing whatever he was doing with whomever he was doing it with, but it was looking more and more that something really bad had happened. And after learning about this news story about Mexico, it really filled Eddie with a whole new set of fears. He was realizing that he didn't know who was who and what was what there in Palm Springs. If his best friend Cliff can be disappeared just like that, those same sort of things could happen to him too. He told one of our favorite Dateline correspondents, Josh Mankiewicz, that it was really scary time for him living there. He didn't know who he could trust. He didn't know who he could confide in. Was there anybody after him too? It really had him paranoid just being associated with Cliff. It was difficult for Eddie to try and process everything when you don't really know anything at all. And now we get another person into sort of the periphery of the story. The tech entrepreneur. His involvement isn't really directly involved. He's sort of one who helped put some of the early pieces of this puzzling story together at a really critical point because it wasn't clear to all of the investigators what exactly they had on their hands here. They knew that they had something. They had a missing Palm Springs socialite and a cast of characters you'd find on some kind of Hollywood movie set. So the next person to enter into the story I just mentioned, the Vegas tech entrepreneur, a gentleman by the name of Tyson Wrench. It was just about the time right after Miguel Bustamante was taken into custody after being caught with that U-Haul as he was trying to make his way with Cliff's personal art collection. Tyson Wrench was looking around on the internet one day when he happened across a missing persons alert on Cliff Lambert on some news website or something like that. For whatever reason, it caught his attention. I also don't know why, but for this missing persons poster that they showed on the Dateline episode, it kind of looked like they used a mugshot of Cliff because he looked like hell in this picture, but maybe that was the most recent picture that they had of him. I'm not saying that Cliff had like this whole entire shady backstory where he's been to jail and to prison. I just say it looks like a mugshot because of what he's wearing and the unhappy look on his face. It's like he just had a really rough night of drinking and got picked up and brought in to sober up, you know what I mean? I thought it was just kind of a weird looking picture, and it was the first thing that popped up into my head that Cliff's missing persons photo kind of also looks like a mugshot too. But anyway, that article caught Tyson's attention, and he scrolled through and he, for some reason, made his way down to the comments. For whatever reasons, I don't always go to the comments when I read articles. It just depends. I think I'll go to the comments if I think they're going to be funny or if I'm looking for links to more news articles about the case, but I usually don't spend too much time reading what other people's opinions are of an article beyond that. However, he did go to the comments and happened to see that someone had written that the last person that commenter saw Cliff with was with a, quote, well-dressed Indian male with a British accent. And that right there immediately struck a familiar chord with Tyson Wrench because he happened to know a well-dressed male that might be mistaken for being from India, but was actually from Nepal. It's a common mistake, and I even made it one time with a parent at the school that I was working at the time. I thought she was from India, but she was actually Nepalese, and kind of joked that it's sort of an insult. And one of my close friends from high school was actually from India, but she was raised in England, and I don't know how or why they ended up in the United States, but she was my neighbor in French class for a few semesters, and we became friends for a time. So yeah, if there's a 50-something-year-old woman from India out there raised in England, it's me from Madame Neal's French class at Cerritos High School. We were neighbors for a long time. Well, anyway, it turned out to sound exactly like someone Tyson Wrench had known from his past, a guy named Kashul Nirula. With the exception of the fact that Kashul is from Nepal and not India, Tyson was certain that the last person that this commenter said that they saw Cliff with was Kashul. So, with his hunch, Tyson contacted the Palm Springs Police Department in order to provide them with this information. He knew Kashul through a mutual friend of theirs, another name that we've heard a few times, and that again would be Danny Garcia. Tyson was familiar with him as well. Danny, Kashul, and Tyson at some point had partied together for several years in the San Francisco nightclub scene, and they had in some way been involved with one another, but Tyson didn't get into the specifics of it all. However, Detective Browning really wanted to speak to Tyson as soon as possible. By this time in 2009, Tyson was living in Las Vegas, so the detective told him, I need you to get here to Palm Springs like yesterday. Tyson was like, I'll be there tomorrow. Tyson Wrench arrived at the police station and was interviewed by the detectives. He explained that it was about 5 years ago he had found a great deal of success in the booming tech industry in and around the San Francisco area, and he became friends with these two. They partied a lot at that time. He described Danny Garcia as a good friend. Tyson explained how charismatic Danny was and how people were just really drawn to him. He had a lot of charm and he was very smart, and not just superficially smart. He had traveled all over the world, and he was genuinely just a fun guy to hang with and to party with. And what Tyson liked was the fact that Danny could afford that lifestyle on his own. Danny had his own means and was able to keep up with a very successful and wealthy Tyson Wrench. He was like that one friend that he had at the time. He had money, and he had availability to just drop everything and fly off to anywhere in the world that they felt like going on a whim. Tyson didn't have to foot the bill for anything that they did together, and he enjoyed that. Danny Garcia apparently explained to Tyson how he came to be so independently wealthy. It came from a pretty traumatic experience, Danny explained. He told Tyson that he was awarded a $500,000 settlement against a Silicon Valley investor named Thomas White, who Danny accused of abusing him when he was a child. The case was actually pretty big news in the area at the time. The local media had covered it extensively, and the fact that Danny won this settlement and was now living the high life kind of gave him this sort of pseudo-celebrity reputation in and around the San Francisco's Castro district, and that's precisely what got the attention of Prince Kashul. And the prince did seem to be kind of a big deal himself, especially when he and Danny palled around San Francisco together. Whenever they showed up, wherever it was that they were going to go party at, a part of Kashul's security protocol as a prince was to arrive in a motorcade of no less than 3 Lincoln Town cars, so nobody would really know which vehicle the prince was actually in. Because if word got out that there was royalty in the neighborhood, people would be coming after him. So the guy traveled around like he's the president of San Francisco. As soon as he walked into the club, he started dropping $100 bills, buying the whole place rounds of drinks, so that everyone would know that the prince was in the building, which sounds kind of stupid since the prince apparently made a big deal about nobody knowing where the prince was arriving, but then made a big, huge production inside that the prince was arriving. Like, which is it? Are you important? Are you worried about people knowing where you're at? Or do you want them to know where you're at, you know? But anyway, Tyson described this time hanging out with Danny and Kashul as a lot of fun, but it got to a point where it was just too much for too long. Tyson had been working in the tech industry for more than a decade, and his plan all along was to make his money and then go live off the wealth for the rest of his life on some beach resort in some foreign country, which is exactly what Tyson ended up doing when he felt like his partying with Danny and Kashul had run its course. And he really wanted to disconnect all the way around. Tyson wanted to just be off the radar for a little while, so he went on a month-long vacation in South America. At some point, while he was in Rio de Janeiro, Tyson got online in order to take care of some bills, and when he did, he found that his bank accounts had been completely drained, and 2 credit cards that he had put away in a drawer inside his house were actually being used, and he could see the charges being racked up on them. So Tyson booked the next flight that he could get back to Las Vegas, and when he arrived home, he found a suitcase in his closet that belonged to Danny Garcia, and inside this suitcase were a whole stack of ATM receipts that came from transactions made on Tyson's bank accounts. What Danny had done while Tyson was on vacation was he let himself into his home. He accessed everything that he needed to gain access to in order to essentially steal Tyson's identity and pose as him while he went around obtaining brand new ATM cards in order to be able to empty out all of Tyson's bank account. And just like that, Tyson realized he had been hustled and taken by this guy the entire time that they had partied together. It was all a part of Danny's long-term plan to rob Tyson blind the first chance he got, which is exactly what he did the moment Tyson left for South America. It was a con literally a decade in the making. Tyson, of course, was upset by the betrayal, but he also felt like he should have known. Looking back at everything in hindsight, it was easy to see how Danny used his charm and charisma to make himself out to be the survivor of this child sex abuse. And at the same time, Danny was so likable and friendly and easy to know, but he also loved to live big and party big. And those things should have stood out to Tyson as a red flag, but I don't know. I don't know if very many abuse survivors who were actually compensated by their abusers later on in life through civil lawsuits would actually turn around and use that money to just party nonstop. Now that Tyson knew the truth, he saw Danny for what he was, and what he was a grifter. Tyson Wrench did end up getting his money back. The bank covered his losses, but Tyson did want to press charges. However, the detective who was assigned to Tyson's case couldn't care less about prosecuting it. I mean, it sounds like a pretty open and shut case of fraud and identity theft, but for the investigators, they were like, we're not really going to do anything unless somebody gets hurt or killed. Somebody needed to be injured or dead in order for the police to take action, and that was that. However, this whole thing really bothered Tyson, the fact that nobody seemed to care. The police weren't going to do anything about it until somebody ended up in the hospital or into the morgue. The bank had insurance and covered the losses and just wanted to move on. Nobody was willing to go after these guys, so Tyson Wrench decided he was going to have to be the one to make sure Danny Garcia faced the consequences of what he did to him. And Tyson is the guy who had nothing but time and money on his hands, so he made it his personal mission to go after Danny himself. And another thing, Tyson Wrench not only had the time, he not only had the resources, he also had the know-how. As it turned out, while Tyson was in college, he worked as a private investigator specializing in high-tech crimes. So this was right in this guy's wheelhouse. And the first thing he did was take a look into that $500,000 settlement that Danny Garcia supposedly received from that San Francisco millionaire Thomas White. This is a very complex case on its own, and I don't want to get too into the weeds about it, otherwise the duration of this episode is going to be more than double at this point. But I actually had not heard of this. And that's probably because I tend to shy away from these types of cases where there's this type of abuse, people getting away with it because they have money and then being sued for what they did in civil court years down the line. I mean, it's important, but they're just not what I'm interested in putting out there in terms of content for Killafornia Dreaming. I don't care to talk about it, and that's just me. The first thing that Tyson found out was that Thomas White was never criminally charged with anything that allegedly happened to Danny, and he vehemently maintained his innocence, that he never did anything to harm or abuse Danny Garcia. And this is where Tyson Wrench dug up yet another name that's going to be added to our cast of characters in this episode, an attorney named David Replogle. Digging around the case that Danny had filed against Thomas accusing him of abuse, Tyson found out something kind of interesting that he wanted to know more about. Right smack in the middle of Danny's case against Thomas, Tyson discovered that Danny and his attorney, David Replogle, took a trip to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And it just so happened that Thomas White owned a vacation home there. And what Danny and his attorney did was absolutely abhorrent. I mean, I've never heard of anything like this ever happening, but what they did was they spent time canvassing the neighborhoods surrounding the resort town that Thomas White owned a house in down there in Puerto Vallarta, and they managed to find 22 boys, just kids that pretty much live in poverty or on the streets, and bribed them into accusing Thomas White of having abused all of them sexually. And as a direct result of those accusations, Thomas White was taken into custody while he was on vacation in Puerto Rico. He was eventually extradited to Mexico, and Tyson Wrench actually went down there to talk to the guy in person. At that point, the best thing Tyson could think of to do next was to talk to him directly. That was going to be the best way that he figured he would get straight to the heart of the story. He didn't want to talk to him by mail or by phone, but face to face. Tyson wanted to go see Thomas White in person where he was being held in a Mexican jail in Puerto Vallarta. And yeah, Tyson actually made that happen. And the two men sat down and just started discussing how Thomas ended up where he ended up. And according to what Tyson says, Thomas told him Danny Garcia, along with his attorney, David Replogle, orchestrated this entire false narrative involving him sexually abusing young boys. Thomas claimed that the two of them came down to where he had a vacation home there in Mexico, and they went around bribing and persuading this group of almost 24 young boys to make up those allegations against him. And therein lies what we might call the modus operandi. The way Danny Garcia operated with his little network of like-minded grifters. I think that's probably the best word to describe these guys, grifters. The last time I used that word to describe any of our criminal defendants was quite a long time ago, when I told you the story of Sante Kimes and how she grifted along with her own son, Kenneth Kimes. Grifters fits very well in with these guys, hopefully not giving away too much of the story too soon. But anyway, according to Thomas White, the idea was kind of similar as to what happened to Tyson and what seemed to be happening at that time to Cliff. His words were they wanted to put him on ice so that they would be able to eviscerate him financially by way of suing him repeatedly. Putting him on ice meant getting him locked up so he would have little to no way of helping his own case. And what's worse, they managed to get him into a Mexican jail where you're pretty much guilty until you prove your innocence. Court documents related to Thomas White's case pretty much echoed what he told Tyson. These are people who have managed to drum up a series of false allegations of child sexual abuse, and this was a calculated and well-planned conspiracy to defraud Thomas White out of millions of dollars by suing him in civil court for the abuse that he was being accused of. Danny Garcia had maintained his abuse allegations are true, that he was victimized by Thomas White, and there is nothing more and nothing less to it. No huge all-encompassing conspiracy. He's just going after what he felt was owed to him by his abuser. The court documents also indicated that many, if not most of those boys that made similar accusations against Thomas White later on would roll back on their accusations and recant what they had said. And according to Thomas White's attorney in that same court document, many of those accusers who recanted did so willingly, but the damage was done. It was too little, too late. And before anything could change for Mr. Thomas White, he died, still locked up in that Puerto Vallarta jail. Another thing the Dateline episode on this case didn't do is get very specific on dates so we can kind of put things into context, particularly around the actual story that we're covering. So I tried to look up a little bit more information about Thomas White. He died in that jail on September 13th, 2013, more than a dozen years ago. He had been sitting in that jail fighting extradition to the United States for 8 long years. The article I found in the San Francisco Gate said, quote, "A San Francisco financier and philanthropist who spent a decade embroiled in a sex abuse scandal in Mexico and in Thailand died in a Mexican hospital Tuesday of pneumonia," his attorney said Friday. Thomas White, 77, had been imprisoned for 8 years in Puerto Vallarta while he fought extradition to the United States on charges that he had abused boys in Mexico and Thailand. White argued he had been set up by con artists. White had recently been transferred from prison to a private hospital for treatment of complications stemming from a knee and shoulder injury, his attorney, Stuart Hanlon, said. He died of natural causes. Although it's a sad way to end, I think he deserved better. Thomas White had moved to San Francisco from Chicago in the 1970s and made his fortune in securities and later on, online trading. In 1978, he started his own firm, Thomas F. White and Company. In addition to San Francisco, he had homes in Mexico and in Thailand. He once donated $3.5 million to an orphanage, school, and hotel near Puerto Vallarta. In 2003, while in Thailand, he was arrested on charges he had abused boys in Mexico. While he fought extradition, he spent almost 3 years in that Thai prison. In 2005, White was turned over to Mexican authorities for trial. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, a federal grand jury indicted White on charges of sex tourism and bringing sexually explicit materials into the United States. He also faced several civil lawsuits. White's attorneys in the United States and in Mexico fought all the charges, saying he was the victim of an elaborate scheme by con artists after his money. According to White's attorneys, the con artists paid Mexican boys to tell authorities that White had plied them with drugs and alcohol and assaulted them. This year, Mexican officials charged 3 Mexicans and 3 Americans with extorting White. White, meanwhile, had given up his U.S. citizenship and became a citizen of Cambodia in an effort to avoid extradition to the United States. His attorney said he was never convicted of anything, but the United States just wouldn't give up. So yeah, wow. The guy spends the last 8 years of his life fighting accusations that this set of grifters may have actually completely made up out of whole cloth. Like that was their story and everybody was sticking to it. I guess, I don't know. I really wonder if Thomas White was an abuser or not. I don't know enough about the case to actually say. Usually those types of accusations are pretty believable, but knowing what we know thus far about Danny Garcia, I mean, it sounds like those accusations might actually have been false. So dreamers, I haven't really gone that deep into this story involving Thomas White. So if any of you listening know more than I do, please fill us in. Let us know on Facebook or on Instagram. Leave some comments or some articles so that we can take a look, because I am kind of curious whether or not you guys think he did what he was accused of or not, or if it was just a complete fabrication by this set of criminals. So the next person that's going to be introduced into our story at this point, I think, is the only female of the bunch, and she would be Riverside County Prosecutor Lisa DeMaria. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and stop here before I start talking about her, because this case is going to end up consuming a tremendous portion of this woman's life, just like it's consumed a tremendous portion of our lives here today, and it's going to carry on into part 2. So I will be back soon with the second part of this. We'll pick up from where we left off. It won't be very long. I've already have the whole thing written, so I'm about at the halfway point in my notes. I'll be back very shortly with the second part of the story, and we'll get to the conclusion of the double cross, what happened to Clifford Lambert. Please don't forget to follow Killafornia Dreaming on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, all the things. Please follow, like, subscribe, whatever you do. Speaking of subscriptions, you can subscribe if you need more content. I do have dozens and dozens of episodes behind a paywall on Patreon. For starting at just $1, you can gain access to hundreds of hours of content that you won't be able to hear anywhere else. I want to thank you all so much for listening. I will be back in the next couple of days with the second part of this episode. And again, thank you. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for listening. I appreciate all of you. Happy New Year. And as always, take care, be safe, and sweet dreams.